When you hear the name Abner Doubleday, what do you see? A Civil War general peering through the smoke at Gettysburg? Or a dusty sandlot where boys in baggy pants swing crude bats at a hand-stitched ball? Some say he fired the first Union shot at Fort Sumter. Some say he invented America's pastime, baseball, though the truth is a bit murkier than legend. But, like all legends, the real Doubleday is buried somewhere between fact and myth, between the echo of cannon fire and the cheer of a ballpark crowd. Tonight, on Faces of History, we meet Abner Doubleday, the soldier, the symbol, the man who stands at the hazy intersection where a nation at war somehow found a game that would bind it forever. I'm the Duke of New York. Lace up your boots. We're marching back to the 1800s where fields weren't just for baseball, but for battle. Long before Gettysburg's gunsmoke and the myth of baseball diamonds, there was just Abner, a curious boy with muddy boots and a stubborn streak, growing up in the rugged hills of upstate New York. He was born in Ballston Spa in 1819, a place you could almost miss if you blinked riding through Saratoga County on a wagon trail. Back then, the Catskills were a patchwork of farmland, forest, and tiny towns stitched together by stagecoach lines and post riders. His father, Ulysses F. Doubleday, was many things: a Revolutionary War veteran's son, a small-town congressman, a newspaperman with ink on his cuffs and politics on his breath. Abner's mother, Hester Donnelly, ran a household where discipline was balanced by books, a rare luxury in a time when many children were lucky just to have dry boots and a warm hearth. The young boy sat cross-legged by the fireplace as his father recounted battles at Saratoga, just a few miles from their doorstep, where American forces turned the tide against the British. Outside those walls, Abner wandered wide fields and wooded clearings with pockets full of marbles, a stick slung over his shoulder for the rough games boys played in any open pasture they could find. Like other village boys, he chased after stray cows, climbed fences, and invented simple games with balls made of stitched rags and sticks whittled by penknife. No scorecards, no official rules, just the boundless energy of a generation growing up in a country still writing its own rules. Young Abner's world wasn't just stories and make-believe ball games. It was also chores, work, and learning how to be useful on a frontier that demanded resilience. He learned to ride a horse before he was 10, a skill every boy needed in a land where a neighbor's house might be miles away. He knew how to shoot a squirrel for supper, split logs for winter, mend a fence, and stand his ground in the rough and tumble scraps that passed for schoolyard discipline in those days. There was church, too. Sunday sermons that thundered about duty and sacrifice. There was the print shop, where he'd watch his father press pages that carried news of a young, expanding nation. There was the one-room schoolhouse, where Abner showed early signs of a mind that could hold rows of numbers and complicated diagrams. Maybe that's where the seeds were planted for West Point, that hard forge on the Hudson River, where boys like him were turned into officers for a country that always seemed to be either building or bleeding. The origin myth of baseball says Abner invented the game on a summer afternoon in Cooperstown, about 70 miles west of his hometown. The reality is simpler and more human. In Abner's childhood, New York farm boys played all kinds of bat and ball folk games: town ball, rounders, one old cat, messy, half-remembered versions of English pastimes. They chalked bases in cow pastures, ran from stone to stone, and made up rules as they went. Outs were argued, fights broke out over fouls, and when the sun sank behind the hills, the boys trudged home to supper, breathless and bruised. Did Abner keep score? Probably not. Did he dream up new rules? Maybe. Or maybe he just played like every other barefoot boy in the Catskills. But in those fields, something took root, an idea that games could belong to a nation, just as much as a flag or a battlefield. There's no diary entry that says little Abner planned to be a general or a legend. But his childhood carved out the spine that would carry him through the darkest moments of America's Civil War. A boy who stood up for himself, even when the odds were poor. A boy who soaked up tales of liberty and nationhood by firelight. A boy who learned that words mattered, that history could be bent and written and passed along like a bat between innings. So when you hear the name Abner Doubleday, don't just see the cannon or the baseball diamond. See the boy who learned how to stand tall among the trees of upstate New York. See the muddy boots, the stitched ball, the dreams bigger than any Catskill hilltop. He didn't know it yet, but every step he took down those winding forest paths led him to battlefields and myths that would outlive him by centuries. When the 17-year-old Abner Doubleday first stepped through the gates of the United States Military Academy at West Point in 1838, he was not the burly legend of baseball lore, nor yet the battle-tested general who would command brigades in the nation's bloodiest conflict. He was simply the son of a small-town congressman from Auburn, New York, a wiry, inquisitive boy with a stubborn streak, a mind for mathematics, and a heart hungry for adventure. West Point in the 1830s was a crucible for the sons of America's rising families, a place where rough boys were molded into engineers and officers, men who would build roads, design fortifications, and lead armies across an ever-expanding nation. Abner found himself among future giants. Ulysses S. Grant would enroll shortly after him. Robert E. Lee had just departed as an instructor. The academy was Spartan and unyielding, long gray coats, stiff discipline, demerits for the slightest offense. For Doubleday, it was a test of patience as much as intellect. Though he was no prodigy, he proved competent in mathematics and engineering, the bedrock of a West Point education. He trudged through geometry and tactics, topography and fortification design. In the cold barracks on the Hudson, he formed bonds that would reappear decades later on far-flung battlefields, friendships forged under the stern gaze of superiors and the steady beat of the morning drum. Upon graduating in 1842, Doubleday was commissioned as a brevet second lieutenant in the 3rd U.S. Artillery. His first assignment was anything but glorious. Garrison duty in remote forts on the American frontier where restless winds blew through half-built stockades and the threat of skirmishes with Native American tribes loomed constantly. He learned the practical skills of a junior officer, how to direct men, maintain discipline, and lay out defenses in rough terrain. He read voraciously, always seeking to strengthen the mind behind the uniform. But the young lieutenant did not remain long in the wilderness. By the mid-1840s, America's hunger for territory pulled him south into the cauldron of the Mexican-American War. Doubleday saw action in the siege of Veracruz and the advance toward Mexico City, part of the grinding, dusty campaign that carried General Winfield Scott's forces deep into enemy territory. For Doubleday, it was a harsh schooling in real warfare, the shriek of shot and shell, the strain of forced marches under a punishing sun, the confusion of battle lines in alien country. He kept his wits about him, demonstrating a calm reliability that would mark his entire military career. After Mexico, peacetime soldiering returned him to the ever-shifting edge of America's frontiers, forts in Texas, Florida, and the coastal defenses of the Carolinas. But Doubleday was more than just a garrison officer. His training as an engineer and artillerist gave him purpose. He surveyed harbors, inspected coastal fortifications, and mapped terrain for defensive works. He believed in the power of fortifications and well-positioned guns, an old-school military mind in a rapidly modernizing nation. Yet the greatest test of his life still waited over the horizon. In 1861, as the rumblings of secession became cannon fire, Doubleday found himself stationed at Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, an aging brick fort whose flag would soon become the symbol of a nation at war with itself. When Confederate batteries opened fire that April morning, it was Major Abner Doubleday who aimed the first Union cannon in reply. He did not know it then, but that single shot would echo across history books, not because of the baseball myth yet to come, but because it marked the beginning of a civil war that would test his loyalty, courage, and engineering mind to their very limits. From cadet to seasoned artilleryman, Doubleday had built his life on precision, discipline, and duty. The battlefields ahead would show whether that foundation could hold when America's very bedrock was cracking apart. Doubleday. By the winter of 1860, the winds of disunion were howling down the eastern seaboard. South Carolina, always the most defiant of the southern states, had voted to secede from the Union on December 20th, the first link to break in what would soon become a shattered chain. Charleston Harbor bristled with tension. Militia drilled on the docks, cannons appeared overnight on sandbanks, and the stars and stripes flew stubbornly above a lonely brick fortress, Fort Sumter. Inside that fortress stood Major Robert Anderson and a garrison of fewer than 90 men, including Captain Abner Doubleday. The Union garrison had abandoned the indefensible Fort Moultrie on Sullivan's Island just days before Christmas, slipping across the dark waters to Sumter under cover of night. It was a bold, desperate move, one that infuriated Charleston's secessionists and made the fort a symbol of defiance. For Doubleday, Sumter was more than just another post. It was a powder keg perched at the edge of civil war, a brick-and-mortar question. Would the Union yield its soil to secession, or fight to preserve its flag? As the weeks dragged on, Doubleday helped strengthen the fort's defenses, mounting cannons in battered embrasures, rationing dwindling supplies, and training raw gunners to stand firm against an attack everyone knew would come. Doubleday's letters from this time reveal a man calm in crisis. He measured the Confederate batteries sprouting along the harbor's edge. Fort Moultrie reclaimed, new batteries thrown up on Morris Island and Cummings Point. He counted guns, estimated ranges, drew maps of enemy positions. He knew the odds. The fort's walls were sturdy but unfinished. Its supply of food and powder was perilously low, and Washington seemed paralyzed by inaction. Yet Doubleday, ever the engineer and artillerist, kept to his post. In the pre-dawn gloom of April 12, 1861, Charleston Harbor erupted. A single mortar shell fired from Fort Johnson arced through the darkness and burst over Fort Sumter, the signal for the opening barrage. Charleston's guns thundered in reply, a ring of iron hurling shot and shell at the battered brick citadel. Inside Sumter's walls, the small Union garrison scrambled to man their guns, and it was Abner Doubleday, standing at the ramparts, who stepped forward to return fire. At 7 a.m., he aimed one of Sumter's 32-pounder guns at the Confederate battery on Cummings Point. He sighted down the barrel, issued the order, and the cannon roared. With that shot, the first return fire by Union forces in the Civil War, Doubleday etched his name forever into America's story. The battle raged for 34 hours. Confederate guns pounded Sumter relentlessly, setting its wooden barracks ablaze. Inside, Doubleday and his comrades fought the fire as fiercely as they did the enemy. Smoke filled the fort's casemates. Men choked on cinders as they dragged powder barrels away from the flames. The Union gunners gave what they could, but the return fire was a token gesture. The garrison lacked the supplies and manpower to mount any true defense. By April 13th, with ammunition running low and the fort a smoldering ruin, Major Anderson agreed to surrender. The Stars and Stripes came down, but not in disgrace. The men of Sumter had done their duty against impossible odds, and their stand electrified the North. Within days, Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to put down the rebellion. The war that had simmered for decades now boiled over. For Doubleday, Fort Sumter was both an ending and a beginning. He had fired the first Union shot, not as the mythical father of baseball, but as a career officer loyal to his oath. That single shot bound him to the coming storm, a storm that would rage from Bull Run to Gettysburg and beyond. Yet even as he stepped off the battered ramparts and into a war that would tear the nation apart, Doubleday remained who he always was, an engineer, an artillerist, a soldier of the old code. He did not seek glory, but history found him anyway, on that April morning when a single cannon spoke for the Union and echoed through the ages. After the smoke of Fort Sumter drifted away on the Carolina tides, Abner Doubleday marched north into a war that would consume the nation's fields and forests, its cities, and its sons. For the next 2 years, he fought as a steadfast officer in the Army of the Potomac, a force often battered, often beaten, but never fully broken. He fought at Second Bull Run, where Union lines buckled under Stonewall Jackson's surprise flanking maneuvers. He held firm at Antietam, the bloodiest single day in American history, where he commanded a division of the I Corps under Major General Joseph Hooker. Under Doubleday's direction, his men stormed through the infamous cornfield, a patch of ground that turned to mud with blood and bodies taken and lost over and over again. Through these trials, Doubleday's reputation solidified. Not flamboyant or reckless, but steady, a rock amidst the chaos. Yet it was in the Pennsylvania countryside, under the blistering sun of early July 1863, that Abner Doubleday's name would forever be bound to the crucible of getting the turning point of the Civil War. In the last days of June 1863, General Robert E. Lee pushed north into Union territory, hoping a decisive victory on free soil would break Northern resolve and win recognition for the Confederacy. The Army of the Potomac shadowed him, step for step. On June 30th, Union cavalry under General John Buford rode into Gettysburg, a quiet market town cradled by gentle ridges and farmland. What began as a skirmish would soon swell into an accidental but epochal clash. When the Confederate columns advanced on July 1st, Buford's cavalry held them off just long enough for the Union infantry to arrive, including the I Corps under Major General John F. Reynolds, with Doubleday commanding one of its divisions. Reynolds, the capable, respected commander, quickly recognized the stakes. The high ground south of town had to be held. He rode forward to steady his lines and was shot dead almost instantly, struck behind the ear by a Confederate sharpshooter's bullet. Amid the chaos, command of the I Corps passed to Abner Doubleday. Baptism by fire. In that instant, Doubleday found himself in command of nearly 10,000 men facing an onrushing Confederate tide. He positioned his regiments skillfully along McPherson's Ridge and Seminary Ridge, ordering brigades to hold against waves of veteran troops under General A.P. Hill and General Richard Ewell. The fighting on the first day was savage and desperate. Doubleday's men, some veterans, some green recruits, fought in blistering summer heat and choking black powder smoke. They poured musket fire into the advancing gray ranks, repulsing charge after charge. Doubleday himself was everywhere, on horseback behind the lines, calmly directing batteries, rallying broken regiments, sending couriers with new orders. He watched as friends fell, as the wounded crawled through wheat fields turned red. Under his command, the I Corps held far longer than anyone expected, hours that saved the Union Army from disaster. But sheer numbers took their toll. Flanked and outgunned, Doubleday's battered corps was forced to fall back through the streets of Gettysburg to Cemetery Hill, where reinforcements finally arrived. The retreat was chaotic, but without Doubleday's resolve, the Union might have lost the high ground that would decide the battle's fate. In those frantic hours, Doubleday had done exactly what the Army demanded. He held the line. Yet his superiors did not reward him for it. Major General George G. Meade, newly appointed commander of the Army of the Potomac, arrived late on the first day. He mistrusted Doubleday, viewing him as uninspired and too cautious, the old regular's demeanor a poor fit for the aggressive style Meade preferred. When reinforcements under Major General John Newton arrived, Meade promptly replaced Doubleday as I Corps commander, an insult that stung deeply. Doubleday obeyed without protest, stepping aside for a junior officer who had seen none of the brutal fighting that first day. Even so, he remained on the field, commanding his battered division through the desperate second and third days. The ferocious defense of Cemetery Hill, the thunderous cannonade that preceded Pickett's charge, the final Confederate repulse on July 3rd. Though history would remember the bayonet charge of Chamberlain's 20th Maine, the stand of the Iron Brigade, and Pickett's doomed advance, it was Doubleday's leadership on day one that helped make any of it possible. His calm under fire and quick decisions secured the high ground that turned the tide of a war. When the fighting ended and Lee's battered army slipped back across the Potomac, Doubleday's moment at Gettysburg became a footnote in official reports. He requested a court of inquiry to clear his name, a plea that never found resolution. His corps was so decimated it ceased to exist as an independent unit, folded into other commands. Doubleday, loyal but bitter, returned to lesser posts for the remainder of the war. He never commanded in the field again as he had at Gettysburg. For the rest of his life, he carried the quiet frustration of a man who did his duty yet saw glory slip from his grasp. While others rose in rank and fame, Doubleday remained the steady soldier, respected by his men but overshadowed by more flamboyant generals. Yet historians would come to see what some overlooked then, that on the first day at Gettysburg, when it mattered most, a quiet, methodical officer named Abner Doubleday held the line and helped save the Union. When Abner Doubleday died in 1893 at the age of 73, the newspapers marked his passing with respectful lines: Civil War general, Fort Sumter veteran, the man who had fired the first Union shot. Few outside old Army circles gave him much more thought. He was one of thousands who had served, commanded back, and faded into the long gray shadows of a war whose scars still cut deep. But then, strangely, incredibly, his name was reborn. Not as a general, but as the supposed father of America's pastime, baseball. The story began to take shape not during Doubleday's lifetime, but nearly a decade after his death, when the young century sought a hero to explain a game that had become the nation's shared heartbeat. By the late 1800s, baseball had swept across dusty sandlots, bustling factory towns, and emerald parks. Yet the game's origin was unclear. An awkward patchwork of stick-and-ball games brought from England, local folk games like rounders and town ball, and evolving American rules hammered out by clubs in New York and Philadelphia. Into this confusion stepped a mining engineer named Abner Graves. In 1905, the sporting goods magnate Albert Spalding convened a commission to settle an old argument. Was baseball an American invention or merely a borrowed English game? Spalding, a proud nationalist and former professional player himself, wanted a myth that spoke purely of American genius. No British roots, no Old World lineage. When the Mills Commission, as it was called, asked for public testimony, Graves answered. In a letter dripping with fading boyhood memory, Graves claimed that in 1839, in the idyllic village of Cooperstown, New York, he had watched a young Abner Doubleday scratch a diamond in a cow pasture and lay out the first true game of baseball, complete with bases, innings, and the concept of tagging runners out. It was a story of perfect symmetry. The boy from the Catskills, a future Union hero, had supposedly given the nation its favorite game on a sunny afternoon, then gone on to fire the first Union cannon at Fort Sumter. The tale was irresistible, simple, patriotic, picturesque. The commission seized it. In 1907, they declared Doubleday the father of baseball. The nation embraced the myth with hungry arms. In the roaring decades that followed, the story of Doubleday's diamond became part of America's folklore. Cooperstown, the sleepy upstate town where Graves said the game was born, built a shrine to the myth, the National Baseball Hall of Fame. Tourists flocked to the village every summer to stand on Doubleday Field, imagining the general as a boy, sketching bases in the dirt while local farmhands chased fly balls under the Catskill sun. But behind the romance, the truth frayed under scrutiny. No credible evidence exists that Doubleday ever played baseball, much less invented it. In 1839, he was actually a cadet at West Point, far from Cooperstown. His diaries, letters, and papers never mention the game. Nor did any of his contemporaries, even those who documented every detail of his long military career. Historians uncovered far more likely fathers. Alexander Cartwright and the Knickerbocker Baseball Club, who in the 1840s codified the rules that made baseball recognizable today: foul lines, 9-player teams, the diamond layout. Yet the Doubleday story endured because it was tidy, heroic, and uniquely American. To his friends and family, Doubleday would have seemed an odd father for a national sport. He was an engineer by training, a military tactician by profession, precise, methodical, fond of chess and mathematics. There is no evidence he ever swung a bat or ran bases for fun. If he invented anything, it was how to sight artillery or reinforce an earthwork under fire. Why the myth endured? Why then did the Doubleday myth take such deep root? Perhaps because myths need heroes with a sturdy name, a single figure on whom to hang the messy birth of a national obsession. Baseball became America's secular religion in the first half of the 20th century, a symbol of fair play, teamwork, and rural innocence in an industrial age. Linking it to a Civil War general wrapped the game in patriotism and nostalgia, forging a comforting tale that the national pastime was born as purely American as the flag Doubleday defended at Sumter. Cooperstown's ballparks, its museums, and its annual Hall of Fame ceremonies kept the legend alive. Each summer, children still run the bases on Doubleday Field, sliding into home as if they're tracing the ghost of the man who never stood at the plate. Doubleday remains frozen in this curious double image: a Civil War general who fired the first cannon shot for the Union, and a mythical boy drawing chalk lines in a pasture, founding a game that would conquer sandlots, stadiums, and TV screens for generations. If the truth robs Doubleday of his baseball crown, it does not diminish him. The real man deserves remembrance for what he truly did: a quiet, resolute officer who stood his ground at Gettysburg, who fought for the Union in its darkest hours and who lived long enough to see the country stitched back together, even if its myths would stretch his story far beyond the truth. In the end, Abner Doubleday did not invent baseball, but baseball, America's pastime, invented him, reshaping a modest soldier into a timeless folk hero. And perhaps in that curious twist, we glimpse something deeply American too, the way a simple story, repeated and polished, can become bigger than any man and live on long after the final pitch is thrown. When the thunder of Gettysburg faded and the Union flag again flew over Charleston Harbor, Abner Doubleday was still in uniform, but the war that had defined him was nearly done. He continued to serve with quiet dedication until the Confederacy's final surrender in 1865. Though he never again commanded a corps in the field after Gettysburg, he stayed at his post, fulfilling the unglamorous duties of garrison command and military administration. A soldier to the end, guided by the same steady discipline that had carried him through cannon fire and controversy alike. After the war, the army that had been his life shrank swiftly in peacetime. Doubleday reverted to the peacetime rank of colonel and resumed his role as a professional officer in a country exhausted by its own survival. He commanded posts along the Atlantic seaboard from New York to Texas, overseeing coastal fortifications he once might have designed as a young West Point engineer. He was stationed at San Francisco in the 1870s, at the edge of a nation now surging westward on iron rails. A land that had changed so much since the young cadet first rode the train to West Point decades earlier. Yet the soldier was never just a uniform. In his later years, Doubleday's mind, still sharp and restless, turned to books and ideas. He read voraciously: philosophy, religion, the sciences. He wrote memoirs of his wartime service, modest volumes that shed light on the battlefields he had helped shape, but did little to polish his own reputation. He never boasted about Gettysburg or Fort Sumter. In fact, he seemed almost to shrug off the glory, more interested in the broader sweep of history than in carving out a legend for himself. He also stepped into a cause that surprised many: spiritualism. After retirement, Doubleday settled in Mendham, New Jersey, and became active in the Theosophical Society, a movement that combined Eastern mysticism, metaphysics, and the belief that the dead could communicate with the living. In an age when the scars of the Civil War had left countless families grieving their sons, spiritualism offered a strange comfort, a channel to reach across the void. Doubleday lent his name, his credibility as a respected old soldier, to the Theosophists' publications and lectures. To him, there was no contradiction. The same orderly mind that once calculated artillery ranges now pondered the soul's journey beyond death. Meanwhile, the myth that would link Doubleday's name forever to baseball quietly sprouted. By the time the Mills Commission crowned him the father of the game in 1907, he had been dead for 14 years and could neither confirm nor deny the tall tale. In life, he never once claimed it, nor did any of his surviving papers. To those who knew him, the idea that the meticulous old engineer drew up baseball's rules in a sunny pasture seemed almost comical. But myths take root in places where truth leaves room, and Doubleday's grave would one become a quiet pilgrimage site for lovers of the game he never invented. In his final years, Doubleday's health declined, but his mind stayed clear. He continued to correspond with old comrades, offering memories of Fort Sumter, Antietam, and Gettysburg to historians who came calling. He enjoyed the quiet of his New Jersey home, the gentle company of books and gardens, far removed from the roar of cannon and the clash of armies. On January 26, 1893, Abner Doubleday passed away peacefully at his home in Mendham. He was 73 years old, an age few Civil War generals lived to see. There was no great fanfare. He did not die rich, nor with monuments already raised in his name, but he left behind a record of duty, an honorable service given without flourish, and a life that had bridged a turbulent century. Fittingly, the man who had fired the first Union shot at Fort Sumter found his final rest in Arlington National Cemetery, the great green hill where the nation's fallen gather under simple stones and swaying trees. There he lies today, among fellow soldiers whose stories echo the sacrifice and contradictions of a country that has always spun legends to soften its rough truths. On his headstone at Arlington, no baseball diamond is carved. No bat or glove marks his resting place. Instead, it bears only his name, his rank, and the wars he served, the real deeds of a man whose courage helped hold a divided nation together when it nearly tore itself apart. Yet beyond the stone and the facts, the myth still dances on sandlots and stadium scoreboards. The boy in the Catskills, the chalk diamond in a cow pasture, the roar of a crowd that never existed. Maybe there's something fitting in that too, that a man who spent his life trying to hold the truth of a fractured nation together would himself become two stories: the real Abner Doubleday, soldier and engineer, and the mythical Doubleday, father of America's game. Between those two, the real man rests in quiet dignity, the myth plays on under summer skies, and the nation, flawed, striving, and full of stories, remembers him in both forms. So next time you stand in a ballpark, smell the grass, hear the cheer, watch the arc of a ball vanish into the summer sky, think of Abner Doubleday. Not because he invented the game, but because he symbolizes how a nation torn apart found new ways to come together, in blood and in play. Faces like Doubleday's remind us that truth and myth often stand shoulder to shoulder, and sometimes we need both to feel whole. If you learned something tonight, share this story. Subscribe, leave a review, and tell your friends that Faces of History doesn't just teach, it plays for keeps. I'm the Duke of New York. Stay curious, stay brave, and remember, some legends live longer than the men who inspired them.